So in this video, we're going to be looking more closely at those two chord types that we were introduced to in the previous video when we were listening to Scott Joplin's soloist, chords 3 and chord 6, the mediant and submediant triads. Just as a reminder from the beginning of the course of where those names come from, if I were in the key of C major and I'm writing notes that represent the roots of the various chord types, C for the tonic, F for the subdominant, G for the dominant, these chords are literally chords that mediate between these two poles. So remember, we have this symmetry that sets up our whole system. The tonic to the dominant above, the tonic to the dominant below, or the subdominant. So the mediant mediates between the tonic and the dominant. The submediant mediates between the tonic and the subdominant. So that's where those terms come from. And when we look at a pattern like that, right away we start to see that new bit of information that we were introduced to in the previous video about root progressions. Up to this point in the course, we've dealt with just two types of root progression by fifth, root progression by second, and now we're going to be interested in root progression by third. That will be the last type of root progression that we learn for this course. And we can see that here. If I did imagine going from, for example, tonic harmony through mediant to dominant harmony, that would be root progression by third. If I went the other way from tonic through submediant to subdominant, that would be root progression by third. As we've already seen in the Scott Joplin rag, when you do that kind of thing, you often have a lot of common tones. But we'll see that when we get into details of chord progressions later on. What I want to do first is go to this melody that's given to us at the beginning of the chapter, chapter 17, which is this melody here. I've simply written it out twice. It's a well-known Russian folk tune. There's a standard harmonization that we're given. I haven't written the whole thing out because, again, I'm concerned with board space. And really what's important for us is the harmonizations that are represented by the Roman numerals and figure bass. The reason why I'm giving it to us twice, of course, is because in our textbook we're given a very famous harmonization of that tune by the Russian composer Modest Mussorgsky. It's from his opera Boris Godunov. And what we'll be doing is listening to that tune and then comparing the harmonic choices that Mussorgsky made in comparison with what would have been a standard harmonization of it. I should mention briefly that if you want to hear a further harmonization of this, which is quite wonderful, there's a piece by Rachmaninoff. It's either for piano, two hands, or four hands, or two pianos, where Rachmaninoff takes this tune and just keeps reharmonizing it over and over and over again. It's a really wonderful piece. But what I want to play for you right now is just this tune, and then I'll give you the two harmonizations of it. So this is the tune itself. And now what we'll hear is a fairly standard harmonization of it. That's the harmonization above. I could imagine a lovely brass quartet playing that. Now what I'm going to play is the same tune again, but this time as harmonized by Mussorgsky. I'll slow the pace of the melody down a little bit. Mussorgsky actually has more harmonic changes taking place, and also it's the colors of the harmonies that he chooses that I want us to get some sense of. I can't help wanting to play it a little bit more softly because I'm picking up on a lot gentler use of harmony in general. The first version has a lot of major quality chords. Alteration to major quality chords is when a seventh is added to them. So the bass triads throughout are always major. Whereas when I listen to Mussorgsky's version, it starts out in major, but right away we go to minor, minor again, minor, 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 major. So you can actually see that being represented in these Roman numerals. And in particular, what I'm noticing is Mussorgsky making strategic choices where he can to shift the sonority away from major. So, for example, first measure, Mussorgsky and the original seem to be in step with each other, although you can see in our textbook that he has a nice little melodic line C, B, 5, 6, going down to 6 in root position. So he wants to have this nice little descent like that. And it's as though where we had a 1, 5, 1 and a lot of 1 to start out with in the first phrase, Mussorgsky wants to substitute chord 6 for chord 1. And where this is just a passing tone, Mussorgsky decides to harmonize it. And then again, where in the original I had chord 1. So if I look at this, I'm seeing the usual idea of a chord being extended by itself in first inversion, and sometimes we have a passing 5, 4, 3 stuck in there, so that's straight out of our textbook. From 1 to 1, 6 and back to 1 again. Actually, what Mussorgsky is doing is, instead of going up by third to E as a first inversion of a C major triad, he's going down by third to A as the root of chord 6. So 6 is substituting for 1. And then when the original goes back to tonic harmony, Mussorgsky pulls a switch yet again. That harmonization 5, 2, we might think 1. Actually, no, we're being given chord 3, again as though it were a substitute for chord 1. And then that idea is confirmed here. And then where the original starts out with 1 again, Mussorgsky again pulls the switch, using 3 in its place. And then when we come to something subdominant in the original, chord 4, Mussorgsky uses chord 2 instead, as though once again he wants that minor sound quality. Where we had a 1-6 being used here, our textbook analyzes this as a whole bunch of neighbor tones, but note that the neighbor tones form chord 2. Here, once again, instead of tonic harmony, we have chord 3. Instead of 1-6, we have chord 6. And then Mussorgsky manages to switch in one last use of supertonic minor quality triad. What I want us to notice then about these particular uses, though, the 6s and the 3s, is that always what's happening is them being used in place of what had been tonic harmony. Now what's striking about that, of course, is that if I'm in the key of C major, which I am here, a mediant chord would be E minor, a submediant chord would be A minor, and these of course are completely different from tonic harmony, which is major in quality. So one of the conventional ways in which mediant and submediant harmonies get used is as a substitution for chord 1, but with this additional effect, and that is to say they change the modal quality, if you will, of that tonic function chord. So instead of us being given a major quality chord in a major key, if we substitute mediant or submediant harmonies, we get something that's minor in quality. It flips around if we're in a minor key. If I'm in C minor, for example, well, mediant harmony is a major quality triad, and submediant chord is also major in quality, right? So there's that kind of modal flip-flop, if you will. And this is why chords 3 and 6 are often referred to as modal chords, when they are being used in some sense as tonic function chords because of that modal shift, going from major to minor or the other way around. They get referred to as these modal chord types. Now, something else is going on here that's of interest to us but also would be familiar to us, and that is to say, I noted this particular use of 1-6 as that idea of a chord in first inversion as extension of something that was being used before in root position. So that's familiar to us from early in the course. In fact, the idea of these chord types, the modal chords 3 and 6, as extensions of 1 is one of the basic types of progressions we'll be interested in exploring later on. But also, as a result of that, of course, you can have them literally as a substitution, taking the place of what would have been chord 1. So it's a familiar idea for us, but we're being given new means to deploy it. Rather than sticking with the same harmony, because we've learned about functional harmony in the interim, we've discovered that we can swap in another chord type to very interesting effect, such as we had right here. So what we're going to do next is look at some of the uses of these chord types. We'll begin with submediant, in particular this idea of moving from tonic through submediant toward a subdominant and back to a tonic function chord again. The reason why I'm doing that is exactly what we heard in Scott Joplin's soloist. So the chord progression there, as you might recall from the previous video, was 1, 6, and something that sounded rather like chord 4. It was a 2, 6, 5, and then 5, 7 to 1. Or in Joplin's case, we had that lovely 1, 7. So we'll start with that particular progression, and then we will move on to other uses of chord 6. In that case, the idea first is going to be submedian harmony as an extension, in some sense, of chord 1. So welcome back. I've redrawn the board, and it's the first progression that we encounter in our textbook that's making use of chord 6, specifically chord 6 as an extension of chord 1. And that's what we're seeing here. So remember, same thing with all of these voice leading models that we work with. We have the same bass line that's being used, and what's being tried out are 3 versions, an A, a B, and a C version, where the melody is starting at a different place, either at the root of tonic triad or whatever chord happens to be first in the progression, the 3rd and the 5th. The first thing that I want to point out are the melodic shapes that we have. To begin with, in this and this, we kind of see a parallel where this thing is repeating the first melodic note 3 times, followed by one of these, and then we move to the end. In this case, we have one of these to start out with, then 3 of those, and then the next. And in the one in the middle, we've got 2, 2 before we move to the final cadential 6/4 progression. So if you're trying to get these kinds of progressions in your ear, think of that melodic line for the A version, 1, 2, 3, cadential 6/4, 5, 1. I'll go to the C version. Instead of 1, 2, 3, and then shift, in the C version, straight away we take the shift. And the B version in the middle. Okay. Now what's paired with that, of course, is this bass line where we are having root progression by 3rd, which you can see literally in these bass lines. So if I play the melody with that, so there's almost a way in which these things all link up with each other in a kind of stepwise ascent. The one thing that's missing so far is scale degree 7, although of course if we left out the cadential 6/4, we would have had that in place. Now, in terms of the voice leading that's taking place, remember that any chords which happen to be root progression by 3rd apart from one another, if I were to sketch out, for example, in this case, I'm dealing with G major. Here's tonic harmony. Here is submedian harmony. So we have a lot of overlapping common tones, just like we would if we were dealing with chords. I'll just keep track of that, chords 1 and 6. supertonic and subdominant. Also root progression by third apart, also double common tones. So if I look more closely at the progression itself, it seems like I have, on a larger scale, tonic function, subdominant function, dominant, and then back to tonic again. So in that sense, 6 is an extension of 1, although it offers that shift in modal quality from major to minor. Likewise, going from 4 to 2, it's extending the idea of subdominant function, again with a modal shift in the chord choice that's being used. Then we have our cadential 6, 4, 5, and 1. So if I play that first progression, this is what it will actually sound like, and you can hear that shifting back and forth between major and minor. And the other thing that you will notice then are all the common tones that you can grab onto, there and there. And also, of course, I have it not just between 1 and 6 and 4 and 2, obviously, but also, of course, going from 6 to 4, that is also root progression by third. And so you can see that there, all right? So that's very typical of root progression by third. It's one reason why root progression by third is a very nice root progression to work with. It gives you literally a lot to hang on to. So I'll play each of these in turn. So the first one, once again, melody and bass. The B version. And the C version. Okay, so that's a very nice progression. Of course, you can also do it in the minor mode, and that's something that we see on the next page of the textbook. And so what I'll do is just play around with this one here so you can hear the changes. So in this case, what I will do is add in the accidentals that I'm supposed to so that you can see how our textbook is working with the same setup. Of course, I need to apply that for it to work. Couple of things. You're given a wrong example and then a right example. I actually like to start with the right example. For you, that's page 300, example B. So instead of what we had before, all I do is immediately shift everything into the minor mode. So it's of interest to us because before, when we did that extension of tonic harmony through submediant, we went from something major to minor. And then, of course, from 4 to 2 is also major to minor. When we're in minor, it's the other way around. It's minor to major, back to minor again. And, of course, in this case, not to major, we're going to that diminished quality chord. And before that, you had a suggestion of taking that supertonic triad and turning it literally into a minor triad, following the idea of a melodic minor use of chromaticism. Get ready for a painful shift. I mean, it's too horrible even to contemplate. The only other thing to really pay attention to is the suggestion that we get in the final example where we start out with exactly the same setup for the opening portion. Sorry, wrong chord. I went straight to chord 4-6. Instead of having to go there, you could also have contrary motion, and that's fine. In any event, you don't need to do anything fancy with this chord progression to take it into the minor mode, and it will sound perfectly good. Now, the core idea here is of 6 or submedian harmony as an extension of 1, just like we had 2 as an extension of 4. In this case, extending tonic function. In this case, extending dominant function. That's the extension function of submedian harmony. However, you also have the substitution function, and that is something that's famously associated with a type of cadence, a new type of cadence for us that's called the deceptive cadence. And it has certain kinds of implications in terms of voice leading and doublings. So that's going to be the next thing that I'll put up on the board. Okay, we're back. We were talking about the use of submedian harmony as an extension of chord 1. Now what we're interested in is the idea of submedian harmony as a substitution for chord 1. However, keep in mind this idea that chord 6 sounds different from chord 1 in modal terms. If I'm in a major key, the submedian harmony is minor. If I'm in a minor key, submedian harmony is major. So if you have a progression where you go from tonic harmony to the submedian, yeah, that's a bit of a shift, but it's not a real shock in any way, shape, or form. However, if you have a dominant chord that's supposed to be going to chord 1, and instead of arriving at a chord with a quality we would expect that would fit with the underlying mode, like I was going from 5 to 1 in the key of C major, I'm expecting a C major triad. Or if I'm going from 5 to 1 in the key of C minor, as I go from the dominant to the tonic, I'm expecting that shift to a minor quality chord. So in that case, if you suddenly substituted chord 6 for what you were expecting, there would be a bit of a surprise. And what would make that surprise specifically deceptive is if you treated the voice leading in such a way that would imply that you were resolving to chord 1. I'll show you what I mean. Ordinarily, if I'm going from 5 to 6, we already know our root progression by second. We know that what we want to do is to have bass and upper parts move contrary to one another, so that if the bass rises, all the upper parts fall, and we avoid the possibility for perfect parallels. Therefore, ordinarily speaking, we might think if I'm going from 5 to 6, I should be doing something like this, which sounds like a very nice chord progression, not a particularly surprising one, I have to say. If I were to do that in minor, though, and if I were making my usual shift in minor, insisting that this leading tone is raised, this is what it would sound like. I have to put that there. It's almost like they are disconnected from one another. And what we have here is an augmented second, which sounds quite ugly. A little bit of that hee-haw sound. So what our textbook says is, right, what you can do instead to make up for that problem, root progression by second, is do this. Now remember, the first time we were looking at doubling something other than the root or the fifth, it was when we were working with chord 2, and we were allowing ourselves to double the third because chord 2 specifically in a minor key is diminished in quality. If we're doubling either the root or the fifth, that would be over-enhancing the dissonant interval in the triad. Likewise, if we double the third, it makes it sound a little bit more like chord 4 having its root doubled. So there are good reasons for us to double the third there. Well, that's the suggestion that we have in our textbook, moving from 5 to 6 in a minor key. So we avoid that hee-haw effect. Instead of this thing leaping down by augmented second, it resolves as we would expect a leading tone to resolve if it's in an exposed voice. That is to say, upwards. And that is a very different kind of sound effect. I might have doubled the third and sixth, but also I have a sense of something that could have done that. And so now, that is something that surprises me. I feel like harmonically, in a way, I've had the rug pulled out from underneath my feet. Now, this is something that I don't just have to do in a minor key. I can actually do that in major as well. And it will sound just as good. And it might even sound better if, instead of just plain old vanilla dominant harmony, we had a dominant seventh. Because I would hear what sound like tendency tones resolving as they should for a conventional dominant seventh resolution. The third of the chord rising, the leading tone rising, the seventh falling by step. And that's going to be true whether it's in major or in minor. And therefore, I would finally want to have a proper resolution of that. This has what we can call a deceptive character to it. The voice leading suggests that in fact we are resolving to chord 1. Whatever we are resolving to is doubling what would be the root of chord 1, as we would expect, but instead it's been transformed into a chord type with the opposite modal quality. Instead of major, we're getting minor, or if we were expecting minor, we're getting major instead. So this becomes the basis for what's known as the deceptive cadence. Now, we have a basic model for that that's given to us in our textbook. And once again, I want to show you what's behind the explicit model that we're given. And that's what I've written out here. What I've shown you is a series of 5/7-to-1 resolutions that are using a particular type of dominant seventh resolution that we're all familiar with. I have a complete dominant seventh. I'm in the key of G minor here. I was dealing with C keys here, C major, C minor, going back and forth. Here I'm in G, and I have my D, F sharp, A, C. That's a complete dominant seventh triad. It's resolving as I would expect. Third or leading tone rising, seventh falling, fifth also falling, to an incomplete tonic harmony. Therefore, what I'm getting out of that is a classic type 1 dominant seventh resolution, from complete to incomplete. And I've put that in every place, okay? Now, what I'm going to do is just one slight shift. So I'll play the chord progression as it stands, and I'm going to change just one element of it when I play it again. So here's version 1. All right, I'm going to keep everything in place except for one thing. What did I do? Well, if I knew what my type 1 dominant seventh resolution was, that's great. All I did was, didn't have an incomplete 1 there. I went to complete chord 6 that happens to have a doubled third, and of course I'm getting that doubled third because it's kind of like the doubled root of the tonic. I should have gotten seventh is resolving as I would have liked. So here is a classic use of the deceptive cadence. I'm going to do the same thing over here. So here's the basic 1, 5, 7, 1 progression, type 1 dominant seventh resolution, and now deceptive. Again, all I did was this. And it sounds deceptive because my ear is being guided by the tendency tones behaving exactly as they should, because I'm treating it as a dominant seventh. The fifth is going down, so I'm getting that doubled root, which happens to be the doubled third of 6. I'll do the same thing for the third progression. Verses. Once again, the only thing that I did, I should have had an asterisk to show the incomplete. The only shift I made was that. So what we have is a basic model for tricking people, not just having submedian harmony substituting for tonic harmony, but actually getting people disturbed by hearing that. They really were being led to expect tonic harmony, especially if this is coming at the end of a passage where you're trying to get back to tonic harmony and suddenly this rises up. It's going to be all the more shocking if you have a 5-7 leading into it and all the components of the 5-7 resolving as they typically should. Now, this isn't to say that this is the only way in which 5 can go to 6. The next thing that I want to show us is how there's a progression we're probably quite familiar with that actually uses the conventional version of 5 to 6, root progression by second, contrary motion, and that would be true both in major and in minor. But to do it in minor, we're going to have to make one important change, which is going to introduce a new idea to us. So that's coming up next. Okay, we're back again, and I've put up a couple more progressions on the board. The first thing I want to mention is there's one error in the textbook. Page 304, you have a cadence that's misidentified at the top of the page. It's example B, which is this, which would be followed by that. It's identified as a plagal cadence. That's 4-1, but this is clearly 4-6-5 in a minor mode. That's a Phrygian cadence. So make note of that or you'll be very confused. Okay, so one thing that we can notice straight away here is we have rather a long chord progression. In both cases, we have a melodic line that is descending through all scale degrees. So remember the previous progression that we were looking at when we were doing these 1 to 6, 4 to 2, the root progression by third, where it's descending by third in the bass. The melodic line was going up and up and up, and if we did 3 of those things and stacked them together, we would get close to a melodic stepwise ascent, but we had to go through 3 of those progressions to get that. Here, in just one swell foop, we are having an entire scale being harmonized in one progression, and it's slightly different way. So I'm using the original major keys that are in the textbook. We'll swap over to minor, but first thing I want you to notice is that they have that in common between the two of them. Now, I'm going to play the first one for you and see what you think about it. Now, I don't know about you, but when I hear something like that, it's almost like I can't quite place my finger on it, but it sounds familiar to me. So what I'm going to do to try to help kind of wake up my musical memory is I'm going to shift things around. The progression is set up so that I'm in the key of F major and I can see a lovely scale descending from F through to F. So that's kind of an obvious framework for it. But what if I pulled out instead this parallel scale that's right here, and what if I put that on top? So this we could imagine being an A version. Let's imagine a B version where instead of the root of the opening triad being on top, we have the third on top, in which case we'd be going from the third of that chord stepwise down to the third at the end. This is what it would sound like. And if I continued on in a slightly different fashion, does that sound like something we know? This is the progression for the Pachelbel, Chaconne, Passacaglia, whatever you want to call it. We know it as the Pachelbel canon, but it's that recurrent chord progression that gives it that Passacaglia or Chaconne-like structure. In any event, you might remember if you took Music 103 with me that when I was introducing the use of Roman numeral analysis, we listened to that very progression because our ear would notice the shift between different types of chord qualities. So if I did have something like this, I'm hearing 2 major quality chords, I'm hearing 2 minor quality, major, major, major. And that was one of the reasons why I said, hey, we want to distinguish between upper and lowercase Roman numerals so that our analysis reflects the way we hear things. And that way this analysis becomes that much more meaningful for us. Okay, well, one thing that we might note about that now that we're into quite a lot more diatonic harmonies, we're mixing up two different types of root progression here. On the one hand, I see these kinds of characteristic patterns that I would expect for root progression by fifth. At the end here, I've got a leading tone and inside voice for a 5/7 chord, so that's why it's a little bit different. So from that to that is root progression by fifth in all of those cases. But in between, we have root progression by second. And when I look at what's happening there, I am seeing that characteristic contrary motion. Given that these things are in root position, right? We're not going to see this all the time, you know, if we have one of them in first inversion. That's much more complex, as we know from earlier in the course. But this is pretty basic root progression by second, and that's what's happening throughout. So actually, Bachelbel was making very good use of both root progression by fifth and root progression by second, and using absolutely correct voice leading throughout. Textbook as usual. Now, what I want us to notice further about this is that I can have exactly the same progression in a minor key. But before I show you that, please note that as I go from 1 to 5 and 6 over to 3, I do get that shift in sound quality from major quality to minor quality. I'm seeing uses of both chords 6 and 3. It's not necessarily clear to me whether this is supposed to be a tonic function or a dominant function. What I have here is a recurring pattern, a recurring sequence of root progressions and voice leading. It's something that we know as a kind of sequence, alternating between root progression by fifth, root progression by second, root progression by fifth, root progression by second, and then the pattern will eventually break so we can come to the end of this. But because of the force of that repetition, our ear starts to lose a little bit of its fussiness with respect to chords playing particular functional roles. That's significant because if I shift this to minor mode, I might likewise not be so fussy. I've gone from F major to F minor, and I'll shift the notation around. I also might not be so fussy about how certain chords that in other circumstances I might be very fussy about and saying, no, that has to be chromatically altered and all those sorts of things. I might not care so much anymore. Now remember that when we were talking before about root progression by second, 5 going to 6, this is when we were introducing the idea of the deceptive cadence. 5 going to 6, root progression by second. Well, move the parts contrary. We saw that we could do that in major, but in minor that was a problem. Why? Because the dominant harmony had a leading tone, and that's what gave us this augmented second in our example going from chord 5 to chord 6. And that sounded terrible, and that was our pathway into the deceptive cadence. But if I have a sequence like this, there's a way in which I might not care so much about having my 5 chord altered in that way. So for example, here, of course, if I'm going into a minor mode, I know I have to shift this, but what if I actually had a diatonic dominant? Now remember, early in the course, I said normally we're going to be assuming harmonic minor for our use of chord types. Therefore, chord 5 in a minor key ordinarily will be major in quality. But I already gave you an example from Rachmaninoff. Where Rachmaninoff does one of these typical Rachmaninoff things. He likes often to have his dominant harmony not chromatically altered. He likes a diatonic dominant, which is minor in quality. Very characteristic sound quality. Of course, something else there, that's from an etude tableau. There's a tonic pedal underneath it. But what's making that piece really work and have that Rachmaninoff sound to it is that minor dominant. Well, I can, without having to sound like Rachmaninoff, I can shift all of this thing into minor in the same way here. Now, if I were to continue in this fashion in minor, of course, I need to change things around. So once again, I'm getting a shift from minor quality to major quality. It's been swapped around, but I'm going from one to the other, and then I'd be back to minor in this case, to minor quality chords. But at the end, to bring the progression to a conclusion, at that point, finally, I would want to reestablish the presence of a leading tone. So once again, in major, it will sound like this. What about in minor with a diatonic dominant harmony? That actually sounds very nice to my ear. I'm not at all bothered by the fact that there's no leading tone there. So what this is suggesting is that sometimes harmonies can play a role that's not just defined by the chords themselves, but by their context. If the context is one that has a very strong linear trajectory, in this case, the idea of a descending scale. If I were in a minor key, ordinarily speaking, if I'm going stepwise down from tonic through scale degree 7, 6 down to 5, I'm going to be using the diatonic or natural minor to do that, just like I would with a melodic minor scale. If that's the idea, if that's the thing that really matters to me, then this type of chord starts to lose any conventional sense of independent functionality. It's part of a larger linear progression. And so now at this point in the textbook, we're introduced to this idea of linear function chords. And here's a wonderful example of that. If I go to a reharmonization of the idea of a descending melodic line, for whatever reasons our textbook decided to shift it to D major, I'll play that pattern for you. Okay, so that is not the Pachelbel progression. What I notice is that it has a lot less harmonic variety. I mean, think of the number of different chords we have over here. Over here, once we've used chord 3 once, then it's subdominant and tonic dominant all the way. So very conventional harmonization over there. In that sense, harmonically, I think a bit less interesting. But what is interesting about the progression is that here we can see a bit more of a conventional functional use. Chord 3 as an extension of tonic harmony. So rather than going from 1 to 1, 6, which wouldn't really fit with that melodic component right there. Again, the whole idea is to have this scale-wise descent being harmonized. To be able to do that, I can't go from 1 to 1, 6, but I can go to chord 3. So that is serving as an extension of tonic harmony. Therefore, I can start to analyze this in familiar functional terms. So that's the major version of it. The minor version to notice there, if I make the shift that's requested in the textbook, like so, again, I'm not bothering to create a leading tone there. The whole idea is to say I want to have a descending minor scale, therefore I can't have some dominant function chord there. Chord 3 fits in very nicely. In this case, of course, if I'm shifting to minor, I have to make these kinds of changes. However, as soon as I hit dominant harmony here, I am turning that into a conventional dominant. So there I'm not using the leading tone. Here I am reestablishing it. In this progression in the minor, it was only at the very end where I did that. Here it was a little bit before the end. As soon as I start hitting these 5 7, that's that characteristic 7th down to the 3rd of tonic harmony and scale degree 5 of a dominant 7th down to 1. I'm going to be expecting to hear the use of leading tone there. Okay, so here are two very interesting ways to harmonize a complete descending melodic line. There are a couple last details I want us to look at. In particular, what about linear possibilities that include more than just the melodic line on top? Is it something that can combine different lines in the texture? Also, is there anything else that we can do with chord 3? Because here it really is part of an underlying sequence, kind of an undecided functional role. Here it has a clearly established functional role, extension of chord 1. Is there anything else that it can do? So our last set of examples will explore that possibility. Okay, we're almost there. Lots of topics being covered in this video. But we have just a few left to take a peek at, and all of them concern uses of chord 3. However, there's a little special twist at the very end here. Number 1, we're taking a look at something that our textbook often likes to do, where something is recomposed, even if it's working with the same notes, but done in such a way that we would interpret it differently. So what we have right here is a progression that's cadential 6/4 dressed up with an escape tone, 5 chord, and that also by extension being heard as an escape tone. Okay? Now, one of the reasons for that, this thing is being set in a triple meter, even though it doesn't sound particularly triple meter in character. The idea being that I can have 2 beats here. Why escape tone? Well, it seems to be the same pattern where the escape tone is somehow anticipating the coming harmony. I mean, technically this isn't 5/7, but we could hear that as though it were setting up a 5/7 chord, and this anticipating the coming tonic harmony. So remember, escape tones always work best if they anticipate the next chord that's coming forward. But if this were treated slightly differently, if I actually put that on a beat here, and I could repeat that, then what our textbook is suggesting is that that would be heard, remember in the key of C major, that would be heard as chord 3/6, or so our textbook argues, that this should actually no longer be characterized as a non-chord tone, an escape tone. It should be heard as being supported by a harmony of some kind, because now it's on a beat. And of course, if we add up all of these notes, E, G, B, that would sound like a 3 chord to many people's ears in the key of C major. And so our textbook says, well, here's an example of chord 3, if it's being used in first inversion, especially if we have a doubled root, as though it were a dominant function chord in some sense. So that's why we have this analysis being provided there, and then tonic function over there. However, I would point out that for many listeners, they would certainly hear a dominant function sonority there, but not because they were thinking of it as chord 3/6 in a major key. What they would actually be thinking of is this idea that I've talked about before. I'm sorry I haven't had a time to do a video on that just yet, but where we take chords and extend them by third. That's typically done with dominant sevenths, where we can add not just a seventh, but a ninth, an 11th, and a 13th. If I listen to something like this, I could note that I'm hearing, as it were, the root and the third and the 13th of a dominant 13th chord. And those are very popular chord types. I would expect that actually most musicians who know something about harmony, if they heard something like this, what they would be tempted to write is this. And say, yes, it is a dominant chord. Of course it is. It's a 5-13 chord. The one thing that you would probably want to really convince people of that would be is the seventh, all right? It's that combination of the 7th and the 13th that really gives us the sense of a dominant 13th chord. It's missing there. The 7th isn't there, so I can see why a case could still be made for chord 3-6. But honestly, again, I'm thinking most listeners will hear that as a 5-13. So does that mean that chord 3 cannot have a dominant function? Well, let's see. We have this progression given to us in the textbook. And the textbook suggests that this could be heard as a kind of soft dominant function chord because we've got this leading tone and exposed voice, and it's moving back up to the tonic as we might expect. That's a possibility. I think what's quite a bit stronger is the next example. It's given we're in a minor key, and let's listen to what that sounds like. And if I do that, of course, I have to shift my Roman numeral analysis. And I'm going to leave it at that just for a moment. Play it for you. A little bit of a creepy harmony. And what makes it creepy is that in this case, I'm assuming harmonic minor once again, which means that in fact this is an augmented harmony. And that means that this harmony, this triad, is a very unstable one. It has built-in dissonance. And when you have something like that, it loads the chord with a kind of instability that drives the music to the next one that's coming. That to me sounds like a convincing dominant function use of chord theory, of mediant harmony, especially if it's mediant augmented harmony. Okay? So mediant harmony has a variety of uses that we've come across. In certain contexts, certainly it can suggest the idea of dominant function, especially if it's in first inversion and is taking the place of what we would normally hear as a 5-13 chord. In root position, especially in minor, if it's followed by chord 1, if the leading tone is in an exposed voice and resolving as we would expect, that's really starting to sound like a true dominant function chord. But now the last thing that we see in the textbook by way of progression examples is this thing here, which is quite odd because I'm seeing something unusual. I'm seeing scale-wise descent, not just in the melody, but also in the bass line. I'm just going to play the soprano line and the bass line together and see if we can notice anything. Now, once again, I have a desire for some odd reason to do this. Again, it's that Pachelbel progression, but it's been reconfigured. So we don't have the motion by lead followed by step, motion by lead followed by step that we had in the original bass line. All we have is a stepwise descent. If I compare that with a melody, I notice that what I have all the way through are parallel tenths from beginning to the end. It's almost like that's the idea. Can I harmonize a scale-wise descent that is guided by the use of parallel tenths? Let me put the harmonies in there. It sounds very lovely, and what's interesting about that is, once again, I don't mind the fact that, for example, dominant harmony is being grossly mistreated here. I actually have the leading tone in an exposed voice in the bass, and if this were a proper 5/6, what I should have is something like that. But instead, I have a bit of a bait and switch. It's not technically a deceptive cadence because the voice leading plainly is not right, but I'm substituting 6 for 1, and that's creating a very lovely effect. But what it does mean is that 5/6 is not really dominant in function. We don't have a dominant chord that's truly dominant in function until we get over here. So once again, this is an example of a linear function chord which is subservient to a larger linear voice leading framework. And what matters in this case is having a lovely sense of descent between two lines moving in parallel motion. Meanwhile, they have lovely harmonizations to fill out the space between them. So we hear this kind of hidden echo of the Pachelbel canon chord progression running right through that. Okay, so we've covered quite a number of topics here today, and I think that what's important at this point is for us to consider what we've left out and where we need to go next. Thus far, what we've left out is chord 7, both as a triad and as a full 7th chord. We need to look at that. There are a couple more uses of 6/4 chords, and that's all that we need to do in terms of the actual chord types that we're working with in this course. We do need to explore the idea of sequence a little bit further, and we also need to get a little bit better grasp on how these things can be combined all together into a single piece. So the next thing that I'm going to do is get us to take a look at the diminished 7th and its use, and I'm going to pick up on all of this material once again in the context of that lovely piece by Schumann, where we're going to see all of these ideas being brilliantly combined with tremendous effect. But we'll get there in plenty of time. I'm sure this is enough for one video. Thank you.